Hello, today on my channel you will hear an amazing story about life. I hope you enjoy this story. This one struck me to the core. Honestly, I still can't forget it. Enjoy watching.
Billy had 4 more years to serve and 6 years behind barbed wire. He didn't write a clemency petition. Some people hoped and wrote such requests, hoping that the higher powers would eventually take pity and open the door to freedom for the poor convict. Billy thought otherwise. He had been given a fair sentence. He had killed a man. The question was, why did he kill him? At one time, he had a close-knit, happy family. Mom raised 2 boys on her own. No doubt about it, the older one, Archie, was smart and good-looking, his mom's pride, and he was going to become a military man, like his father, who died early, and Mama had a soft spot for Archie. Billy grew up a thin, sickly boy, and he loved cars more than anything else. And his best friend was the chauffeur who used to drive his daddy around. He taught Billy how to drive too. It turned out the kid had a real talent for it. Now he had no doubt that he would go to the Polytechnic Institute to study automobile engineering. Billy wanted to design model racing cars, and he also dreamed of becoming a racing driver himself. Why not? But there was a story about a year ago. This guy speeds into an intersection and crashes into another car. Killed an elderly man. But Jacob didn't get any punishment. The way the case had been handled, it was the dead man's fault for the traffic violation. Billy had no doubt that everything possible would be done to keep Jacob out of jail. At the very least, if irrefutable evidence came to light that the company had robbed the kiosk and killed the saleswoman, it would be the companions of the real culprit who would get jail time, not him. Jacob would remain on the outside, still doing as he pleased. Billy couldn't stand it. So he dealt with the scumbag who'd ruined his life on his own. He waited for him in the driveway and, in court, he pleaded guilty and said he'd do it again. This is not the Caucasus with blood feuds. The prosecutor was furious. How did you know that the young man you killed was involved in your mother's death? You solved the case yourself, passed the sentence and carried it out. But what if everyone does that? Where would society go from here? In short, it was premeditated murder. Billy got 10 years and was sent to juvie. His life was tolerable for a while. The convicts soon found out what the gray-haired kid was in for. From their point of view, he was worthy of respect, and he wasn't abused in the zone. Besides, he was useful to the cons. A literate man is always useful here. That's why the convicts asked Billy to write letters to his relatives and favorite girls, to compose petitions for pardon and so on. For this they fed him and tried to make his living conditions a little easier. Billy was never spoiled. He worked on an equal footing with everyone else, did not snitch on others, did not bend to his superiors. He was withdrawn and silent, but those with whom he served time did not blame him. Modest, quiet, he knew his place, but he did not allow himself to be humiliated. And perhaps the guy would have served his time quietly, but the head of the colony changed, and a certain Mr. Walker was appointed to the post. Unfortunately, he turned out to be a friend of the criminal whose son Billy killed, and Walker promised to make life unbearable for the prisoner. The easiest thing to do was to get one of the cons to do it. It's not uncommon for a man to be poisoned like a wild animal behind barbed wire. Eventually, unable to bear it, he'd take his own life. But even the local authorities refused to go against Billy. He went to jail for his mother. It was the right thing to do. Mother's sacred. So they had to use the old tried and true methods. They started putting Billy in the punishment cell. Any excuse was good enough. From a button undone out of order to the fact that prisoner Zavialov introduced himself out of uniform. Billy was not known for his good health, and he realized that sooner or later that SATIZO would finish him off. He was always alone in the isolation cell. The heating in the cold winter months was fictitious. The radiator was barely warm, but the upper pane of the window was broken and snowflakes flew into the cell. They stripped down to their shirts, and you had to serve 2 weeks in such an environment and on meager food. One time Billy came down with pneumonia. He was delirious, didn't recognize anyone, and the nurse went to give him shots. In short, it was a miracle he got out of it. The next time, when Billy was deprived of a visit and sent back to the isolation ward, he went on hunger strike, though he had no hope of success. If a convict dies, it's no big loss. Later he was treated a little in the camp hospital, and everything started again. Somehow, however, having served time in the isolation center, Billy survived the bitter winter months and waited for spring. Now he could not be killed by frost. And then the convicts told Billy the boss's plan, which they had somehow learned about. Soon prisoners from another camp would be transferred here. Some men will be locked up in the isolation ward with Billy, and they'll just lower the guy. They'll never get out of it. You have to run away, Billy, the local authority told him. We'll organize it somehow. There's no other way out. And indeed, his friends in distress did. The escape was a success. Billy was suddenly free. He had no money and documents. He had to lay low, as the same authority advised, and then find the people who would help him get a clean passport. If you don't want to go back to the zone, go to a construction site, one of the convicts told him, where the work is hard and dirty. They take everyone, and then you'll find something better. Sooner or later, they'll forget about you. They'll stop looking. The only thing Billy allowed himself to do when he was on the outside was to contact his brother, though the cons advised him to keep quiet for the time being. Archie had been in the service a long time, but after what happened to his family, he changed his mind and didn't join the military. Now he worked as a forester in a remote area. All these years he came to see his brother, sent him food and things, and he never blamed him for anything. That's life. You never know what can happen, he said, and once he added quietly, I would have done the same thing as you. Don't blame yourself. When Billy dialed the familiar number, he had one goal in mind: his brother must know he was alive. After all, they had no one left but each other. He expected Archie to be horrified at what he'd done, because by the time he escaped, Billy had already served most of his sentence. And now, if he were to be recaptured, he would surely get more time. But all his brother said was, "Wait, I'll come get you, and I'll take you back to my place. Then we'll figure out what to do next." "Why do you?" Billy began, but Archie wouldn't listen. "We'll only agree on a time and place," he said. And on the appointed day and hour, Archie put his brother in the car and drove him to his village. He lived in a house on the outskirts of the village, where there was no fear of unexpected guests or idle visitors. The road was visible from afar, and it was impossible to come here unnoticed. Billy was wanted, of course, and his only relative had been contacted. Archie was adamant that he knew nothing. He decided to let time pass. He'd find Billy the best lawyers and get him transferred to another penal colony. There his brother would finish his sentence and then start a new life. It hurt Archie to look at his brother. Billy didn't look like himself anymore. He used to be a bright little boy, smiling, trusting. And now, skinny, his face blackened, his eyes like a hunted wolf, you couldn't look him in the eye. Mom wouldn't have survived seeing her son like that. Archie gave Billy goat's milk, fed him country bread and porridge. "When you come to your senses, when you look like a man, then we'll talk," he said, every time his brother talked about the future. In the morning Archie left, the forester had a lot of duties, and Billy stayed behind to take care of things. There was internet in the hut, so Billy quickly found the man who had poisoned his life in the colony. In a short time he had gathered all the information he could about him. Harry was wealthy and prosperous. His career was going well, and his last position was a very lucrative one. As for his personal life, the colonel was no less fortunate. With his first wife he separated. There were no children in the marriage. But a few years ago, Walker remarried. His wife, Betty, ran a dog-catching service. A beautiful, shapely woman often appeared on local television, saying that she wanted to create shelters for homeless animals. In reality, however, outraged dog owners said that dog catchers grab everyone, even well-groomed domestic dogs, as soon as the owner turns his back. The fine for catching is big. Some old lady, who lost her share Korzuka by negligence, can't afford to pay it. It's half of her pension. And it is impossible to call to the place where the animals are kept. And it is not a fact that when you come with money and documents to pick up your pet, you will already be alive. He can easily be torn in the cage by other, larger and more aggressive dogs, or he could catch some disease. Billy squinted at Inna's serene face. He would remember that woman. He wanted badly to hit Walker where he was most vulnerable, to make the colonel beg for mercy. Harry also had another daughter, Kathy, out of wedlock, but it seemed that he had not been in touch with her or her mother for a long time. A fleeting affair, so to speak. Nevertheless, Billy did his best to keep the girl's appearance in his memory, and he had a great memory, trained by prison. Sometimes it kept him from going crazy. In the isolation ward, he recalled poems, pages of books he had resurrected some happy moments of life then, and his mother and Archie, they were still together. And now Billy, not knowing that Archie was looking for a lawyer for him, dreamed of the day and an hour when he would have in his hands one of the women who were dear to his tormentor, and their fate would depend on him. When each day is like the next, time stretches on endlessly, but when you look back at the years that have passed, they seem to have flown by in an instant, just that you were 18, and here is already 26, 27. Sad is not that you are aging, you are still in the prime, and in the future you will have every opportunity to maintain their beauty. It's not a problem when your husband is rich. The sadness is that you acutely feel the transience of the years and realize that you miss a lot. And how many hopes and plans you had. No, Kathy never dreamed of studying at a prestigious university, then become a businesswoman, build a career. At 18, she was a laughing girl whose main wealth is a professional camera, with which she has so much in common that it became a part of her body. Katie had a keen sense of beauty. She could stand for a long time and contemplate a landscape that caught no one else's attention, and then capture it in a photograph, and everyone would gasp as they looked at the picture. A snow-covered branch, a white pigeon pecking rowan berries, a caterpillar on a blade of grass, its reflection in a puddle against the clouds. The girl dreamed of devoting her whole life to photography. She needed money to buy herself a house on wheels and travel the world. She wanted to serve beauty with a capital letter and give it to people. Sometimes it seemed to her that she was making the blind see, allowing others to see how beautiful the world was. For her coming of age, her mother gave Katie a trip to New York. She knew how long her daughter had dreamed of seeing this city, wandering its streets, visiting its museums. Katie even shrieked with happiness like a little girl. Her mother usually did not spoil her, she just did not have such an opportunity. Katie knew nothing about her father. She avoided asking questions, anticipating that the subject would be difficult for her mother. But later it turned out that this first independent journey in her life changed the whole fate of Katie. The train arrived in New York at night, and it was clear that it would be better to wait for morning at the station. Katie wandered through the huge, humming building with sleepy eyes. She bought herself a salad, coffee, and a bun at the all-night cafe. And then I couldn't stand it, found a paid waiting room, and there, having settled down in a soft armchair, dozed until dawn. Then she went to find a hostel where her mother had booked a place for her. Seeing a cheap hotel, the girl was delighted, because for a whole week, she was to live in an old house on the Fontanka. Part of the rooms in the hostel overlooked the courtyard, and it was a real stonewell, bringing a depressive mood. Such occurs after reading novels. But beyond the windows of the room in which Katie was placed was the waterfront, and in the evenings many lights were reflected in the river. By the evening of her first day in New York, her legs were buzzing, and her pedometer showed 60,000 steps. Yet Katie still had the energy to go to the house of books. Reading was her second passion, and she wanted to pick up a novel for the evening. Who could say that a visit to this store would turn out to be the beginning of a real romance for her? For the first time, she and Tony saw each other among the shelves of books. The girl was impressed by a man of pleasant appearance in an elegant black coat. Tony later said that he had mistaken Kathy for a foreigner. "I thought you were French. After all, you cannot be called beautiful, but my God, how charming you were," he said with some surprise. "Those big green eyes, loose brown hair, bangs to the eyes. I could not take my eyes off you. And when you smiled, that was the kill shot. I was dead." Tony then spoke to Kathy, asking for her advice on choosing a book. Then asked if she was a girl or a commuter. Kathy admitted that she would be in the northern capital for only a few days, so want to see more during this time, but there is a limit to physical strength. For example, today she was so tired that she could hardly stand on her feet. Tony invited Kathy for a strong coffee at a cafe that was literally a stone's throw from the house of books. Then he offered her his services as chauffeur and tour guide. "I'm not from around here either, but I've been to New York many times, and I know it well. I have a good car, you will not get tired, and will be able to see much more if I take you through the streets of the city and show you everything you wanted to see." Although her mother brought up Katie quite strictly, and one of the unwritten rules was not to get into the car with strangers, the girl for some reason could not resist and trusted Tony. And everything changed. She really didn't know tiredness anymore. Often Tony would pick her up in the morning, and then they would go somewhere. Sometimes Tony was busy in the mornings, and then Kathy spent the first half of the day at a museum, and then her new acquaintance would find an opportunity to show her New York from an unexpected angle. For example, its courtyards and rooftops. The latter especially fascinated the girl. She and Tony usually went up to the rooftops at sunset or when it was already dark, and looked at the city flooded with lights, lying at their feet. And then there was still strength to ride on a motorboat on the rivers and canals, to sit in a restaurant, to see how the bridges are drawn. And of course, Tony and Kathy talked a lot. The girl opened up to her new acquaintance first. She told him how she and her mother lived, told him about her plans to become a photographer and traveler. She regretted that except for her mother, she had no soulmate. It's very sad that everything turned out this way. If Mom had a loved one, she wouldn't feel so lonely. And so, she often says that I will get married, and then I will have my own life, and there will be no room for her in it. I try to talk her out of it, but we just end up crying together. Really, I feel so sorry for her at times like this. Tony listened intently to the story, and Kathy felt that he understood her as well as anyone. Kathy knew that her new acquaintance was not a poor man. The way Tony dressed, his expensive foreign car, and the fact that he took Kathy to the best restaurants in New York told it without a word. The girl only awed at the prices on the menus. She either offered to go to a simpler cafe or was eager to pay some of her own money. Tony just chuckled. And one time he took Katie to a psychic. The woman didn't advertise herself, she was well known, but only a select few came to see her because her services cost a lot of money. Katie was impressed by the old house, which was made of slabs so dark they looked black. And the owner herself was a very thin woman whose eyes seemed to emit a witch's light. She wore a silk Japanese robe and smoked all the time. Without saying hello to Tony, she nodded at Kathy. "Do you want me to tell her what's in store for her?" Tony nodded. "Then you wait. You know I need to stay with the man face to face." Tony took a seat on the couch in the living room, and the landlady led Katie into the small room. The girl was prepared to see something unusual: black candles, some paraphernalia necessary for witchcraft. But she found herself in ordinary surroundings. The walls of the room were simply whitewashed, and all the furnishings were 2 armchairs and a low table on which a lamp was burning. The heavy curtains were drawn, and there was a stick of incense smoking. The fortune teller seated Katie. She treated the girl like a doctor treats a patient. For a while she held her hand as if to feel for a pulse, her brow furrowed. Then it was as if she'd forgotten all about her client. She laid out the tarot cards on the table and remained silent. "Well," Katie couldn't take it anymore. "Can you tell me something?" "I won't take any money from you," Aglaya said suddenly, "and don't tell anyone about what I'm about to tell you. You're about to start a new life like you've never known before. You'll have everything." "Will I marry?" Katie asked timidly. There was no way she could have everything herself. It wasn't the right income. Unless she got a husband. And Kathy was beginning to dream that it would be Tony. "You'll get out," the fortune teller nodded, "but sadly, you'll get what you never dreamed of before. But you can't believe it." "Why not?" "It's alien," the woman said simply. "You'll just play at it and you'll get bored. As soon as you feel it, go away, don't look back. If you linger, it'll be bad for you. And what happens? You'll die, and I won't say anything more about it. Why don't you want the money?" "That's not what I want from you. I want you to bring me the balloon. Don't forget that. Don't sell it, and don't keep it for yourself. Each thing has its own destiny, and each thing must have its own owner." "What kind of balloon?" Katie was confused. "I don't have anything like that." "What makes you think so?" "You'll find out in due time," grinned the fortune teller, "and no one but you can do it." "All right, I won't torture you with riddles. If you sell the work, you'll get a lot of money, of course, but it'll only bring you grief. You know how it happens. A man wins the lottery, and suddenly he needs this amount for the treatment of a child or for a funeral. And if you keep it for yourself, you'll be cursed like me. The greatest happiness is that a man doesn't know his future. But I do. Both my own and other people's. That's my curse. I can't change anything." Katie ignored these words. The strange woman had promised not to speak in riddles, but continued to be dark. "You better tell me, will I be happy?" asked the girl. Suddenly the fortune teller smiled, and this smile turned out to be warm and even affectionate. "You will be, but not in the way and not then, as you see now." The woman stood up, signaling that the audience was over. Tony, who had been waiting for Kathy to return, leafing through a magazine, hurried up to meet them. He took out his checkbook. "The usual?" he asked, and the girl realized that he was a regular customer of the fortune teller. But the woman shook her head. "I'm not taking anything. Not a dime." "And you," this was addressed to Katie, "remember what I told you. It's amazing, Tony muttered as they walked down the stairs. She usually charges a fortune for a single session, and people are willing to pay because she's never cheated anyone. And this time she's being so generous. What did you bribe her with? Katie just shook her head. I don't know. And what did she tell you? The man continued to ask. The girl wanted to tell, because she didn't see in the words of the fortune teller anything especially significant, so verbal fog. But then the sorceress stood before her mental gaze. She put her finger to her lips and said, I can't tell you about it, she said. I can't talk about this, Katie said, or it'll be a disaster. Then don't. Tony seemed frightened and turned the conversation to another topic. 10 days of vacation flew by for a long journey. The groom rented an old manor and arranged a party that would have honored some rich noblemen of the 19th century. And since it was already fall, he took care of an appropriate outfit for Katie. Her dress was made to order from a special fabric that was very beautiful and at the same time dense. Then a white fur cape was chosen. Kathy was afraid to even touch the earrings and necklaces. She thought they belonged in a museum. And during the whole party, she was afraid of losing the expensive jewelry in case something happened to them. Musicians were invited, and fireworks exploded into the sky. Both the girl's mom and Katie's friends were completely shocked. Well, you've got a fish, said one of the girls and added with a little envy, golden. Katie didn't see the place where she was to live until after the wedding. At first, she was worried about her mother. How would she be alone? But to her surprise, the solution was very simple. I'll invite my cousin to stay with me, Mom said. Her daughter got married recently, but there's no place for them to live. Lucy will give them her apartment and she'll move in with me if that's all right with you. Katie was ready to throw herself at her mother's neck now that her heart was at ease. Mommy and Aunt Lucy got along so well that they would be very happy together. Tony's house was more like an estate. The large mansion stood in the middle of a huge plot of land. There was room for an exquisite garden, a pond, and numerous buildings. Arbor, bathhouse, summer kitchen, billiard room, winter garden. The girl was impressed by the high stone fence and the guard at the entrance. And not symbolic like those aunts and uncles who are considered guards at school. He was a well-built middle-aged man, armed, and his eyes were so cold that Katie knew he would use a gun if he had to. She was reminded of her father. But it was the tiger that made the biggest impression on Katie. Yes, Tony had his own tiger, a large and formidable beast. He had a special enclosure that was hosed down every day. Aren't you afraid? Kathy asked her husband. What if he runs away? Tony shook his head. I got Arston as a little tiger cub. Special trainers work with him, corrected his behavior. So now he is quite predictable, and the enclosure is secure. Arston was well fed. In addition to meat, the tiger received special vitamins and supplements. He didn't know what hunger was, he didn't experience cruel treatment, and when the tiger lay resting after dinner, bliss was written on his face. The only thing you've deprived him of is a tigress, Katie once said. Maybe you once loved too. And tiger cubs. That's something to think about, Tony chuckled. Meanwhile, after the wedding, first a year passed, then another. Tony and Kathy still hadn't had children. Maybe I should see a doctor, the young woman said cautiously to her husband. He only brushed it off. The problem is not you, to me, but it's not that serious. The doctor said that no special treatment is needed. Don't be nervous, lead a healthy lifestyle, and sooner or later everything will work itself out. But it didn't. In addition, if the first time Katie sincerely thought that she lived in paradise, then began to notice something. Her husband never refused her anything, and she could ask him for anything. But she had to stay in the estate all the time, and she had to leave it only in extreme cases. Tony was absolutely against her going to school or getting a job. People work hard to earn their bread, he told Katie. What do you lack? But those who have a job they love don't just work for the money. The young woman objected. You mean photography? Tony asked, but you can take pictures of anything you want here. Our garden is so beautiful. Finally, we can go out from time to time, even to other countries. But he could see from his wife's face that she wasn't happy about the prospect. Are you bored? He guessed and realized that he had hit the mark. But you can invite your girlfriends to your place. There is internet, home theater, swimming pool. Want to find you someone like a companion? The wives of other businessmen came to his mind. They still went to visit each other, did charity work, visited nightclubs, went to the theater. He came to the conclusion that Kathy would have to explain why she couldn't lead such a life as well. You see, he began cautiously, my business is. It's quite dangerous. I'm always at risk in some way. You realize you have to be very careful when you do that. The bad 90s. But it's long over, Katie interrupted him angrily. And what is it that you do? It's not drugs, is it? No, Tony was serious. But I'm involved in a serious business. Take my word for it. That's all I can tell you for your own safety. The risk extends to you. I love you and I don't want anything bad to happen to you. How did you and I walk the streets of New York, day and night? We were guarded. You just didn't see it. Katie shuddered. So there had been guards around all that time, and she hadn't even realized it. Tony had managed to hit a particularly sore spot in her soul. You're safe here, Tony continued, stroking his wife's arm. The house is secure. Everything is under surveillance. You only notice one guard like everyone else. In fact, there are many more, and they're professionals. Kathy was completely dumbfounded, and Tony continued. Here's the deal. A couple of times a year, you and I will go on trips. There you'll see the world, and you'll be able to run around with your camera, and I'll buy you the best one. Until then, please obey me and stay at home. I'll try to take you somewhere, out of town or to the theater for a premiere. But once in a while, that's all I can afford. Katie also learned that she was Tony's second wife. Tony had a son from his first marriage. The whole family lives nearby and enjoys a lot more freedom. So they're not in any danger. The young woman asked, unable to hide the irony. But Tony didn't see the catch. I have not kept in touch with them for a long time. For several years I have not seen my son, did not call him, did not congratulate him on his birthday. And not because I don't love him. It's just more peaceful. People with whom I would not want to do business monitor my correspondence, calls, meetings, and they realize that my son doesn't know anything that I could pass on to him. And since I don't seek to see Nani even furtively, I guess they figured I didn't care about him. No, I'm going crazy, exclaimed the wife. Well, at least give me some hint. Tony just shook his head in the negative. For all the years of their life together, Kathy had managed to get a single secret from her husband. It happened accidentally when they were vacationing in Thailand in an expensive hotel where there were no strangers. And there was a moment when Tony had a drink and relaxed a bit. They had a villa with its own pool. They were lying on sun loungers, no strangers around, unless you counted the same mysterious security guards. Katie knew her husband had taken them here as well, but somehow they managed to stay out of her sight. Sipping her cool wine, Kathy asked her husband why he was so afraid for his money. Maybe if you put it in a safe place. My fortune is not in money, Tony said. Money is dust. So what is it in? In stocks. He shook his head negatively. In gold. Already warmer, and then he found it necessary to clarify, I invest in precious stones. And not just ordinary diamonds, rubies, and emeralds. Each of my stones is unique, has its own name. But it's hard to put a price on them. So you keep them in a jar? Katie's heart was pounding as her husband was finally being a little frank with her. No, you can take them out of the bank. I have a stash, Tony laughed, and Kathy realized that her husband was completely drunk for the first time in her memory. Well, it's probably easier to steal from a stash than from a Swiss bank. The trick is where to hide it. Try guessing. In the house? Out of the way. In the garden? Almost right. In Arsten's aviary. When they wash the enclosure, the water runs into the... In short, you have to lift the bars, and there's a door on the side. Dial the code. Which one? None of your business. And yet my greatest treasure is not diamonds. It's the crystal ball. Katie's heart sank into her heels. She'd almost forgotten the fortune teller Aglaya, and now it was time to remember her. A crystal ball? She acted surprised. They're easy to buy and inexpensive. What's the point? It's a legendary orb. It belonged to an ancient prophetess. You can see the future in it. I don't know, I haven't tried it. I'm afraid to be honest. And Tony practically repeated Aglaya's words. Blessed is he who does not know his destiny. The next day Tony forgot all about the conversation, but Kathy remembered it forever. When they returned home, she tried, without realizing it, to befriend Arsten, even though she was heartbroken at the sight of the mighty beast. She began to help the man who took care of the tiger to feed him, and even sometimes dared to stroke the tiger's strike back. Actually, this was the only thing that brought thrill to her life, and so every day was the same. Katie spent time on the internet, reading or watching movies, chatting with acquaintances. She hadn't picked up a camera for a long time, and it seemed to her that little by little the talent she had was gone. It took Katie a long time to come to terms with her life. It was as if she were asleep, doing the same thing every day, walking along the garden paths, and life whizzed by. Then she got sick, that newfangled disease that is still debated whether it is real or invented to frighten people. God knows who gave it to Katie. She was a total recluse at home. Maybe a servant brought it to her by accident, or one of the guards. Katie began to freeze in her room, which was always as warm as the tropics. She took her temperature, was horrified, and with a gut feeling she realized it wasn't the usual flu, it was the very disease she'd never been vaccinated against. The young woman's illness was unusually severe. Although Tony had brought the best doctors, injections, and systems, Katie was so weak that she could barely get from her bed to the chair, where she could sit for no more than 5 minutes and immediately wanted to lie down. And at night she was suffocating and kept looking for a position that would make it easier to breathe and allow air to enter her lungs. It wasn't until about 3 weeks later that Katie was convinced that she wasn't going to die, that she was going to get better. During this time, she had resigned herself to the idea that life might already be ending. So when she realized the disease was receding, it shook her to the core. Things that hadn't moved her before now moved her to tears. For example, she could spend long hours at the window, admiring the bullfinches that flew to the feeder. The rays of sunlight falling on her face, the clouds in the sky all seemed unusually beautiful to Katie. It was then that she began to realize that in recent years she had not lived, but had existed in a kind of half-remembered oblivion. And she realized that she couldn't go on like this. Not so long ago, Kathy had thought she loved Tony and needed no one but him. And now she realized clearly that she had enough determination to leave her husband. Life is more precious, and it is life she wants to live to the fullest. Katie even clearly understood what kind. She wants a home on the land, not a grand mansion surrounded by a garden of paradise, but a simple house where everything would be arranged to her liking. On the walls would hang her photographic pictures, reminding her of happy moments, and she herself would be tending to the beds and flower beds, and everything would grow, green, blossom, and bear fruit. Kathy would give life to herself, even if it was just rose bushes or young apple trees. This was the young woman's secret plan, and she shared it with no one. She sat all day long on the internet, going through photos, looking for options. Katie believed that she would recognize her house as soon as she saw it. Tony had long ago opened an account in her name so she could use the money freely, and she often ordered her favorite items through online stores, so she'd have enough to buy a modest house. That wasn't the hardest part. Katie realized that she would have to leave Tony, but she was afraid to even imagine talking to him about it. She herself couldn't understand why the thought of such a conversation instilled fear in her. Of course, her husband would do everything he could to talk her out of the decision. Kathy even thought that Tony might not let her go. What would she do then? In the end, she decided that first she would leave and then from afar, write him a letter explaining everything. Now she wasn't surprised that Tony's first wife couldn't stand living in a golden cage. And who could? Those girls who chase wealth want to show it off. They need girlfriends who will pale with envy at the sight of luxurious outfits, jewelry, photos from cruises, and other attributes of a luxurious life. And if you enjoy all this alone with yourself, no, that's not it at all. Katie did not dream of joining the chosen few, the elite. Therefore, for her, such a life was especially difficult. The young woman wondered how she would support herself. Perhaps she could sell the diamond ring Tony had given her. It never occurred to her to question the division of her husband's fortune. His wealth belonged to him alone. She had no claim on it. And if Tony understood and allowed her to leave, he certainly wouldn't mind her taking her personal belongings, the ring and the money that had been in her account for a long time. And then there was the call from Naomi, Tony's first wife. The owner himself wasn't home at the time, and it happened that the answering machine recording was listened to by Kathy. "Hi, it's me," she heard a voice say, and immediately realized it was Naomi. "I'm sick of all this, frankly. The fact that you forbid me from calling, that I can't see you when I need to. Our son was sick the other day, and you didn't even know about it. You can assure anyone that you don't care about Sasha's fate, but you can't fool me. I'd rather you were a bus driver and we lived a normal life than all this. You've infected me with fear, and I'm lying to everyone that I forgot about you a long time ago and don't want to see you. Maybe Sasha and I should move abroad to some southern country, and you could come to us. I know that your son is dear to you, and that you won't have any more children after all these stupid experiments with chemicals. Now you're keeping us out of your way because of this will. Sure, it's fair if your son gets a share of your fortune, but your new girlfriend will get something. And why can't you just fill out a document with a lawyer? Why do you need us to stay in this town? I don't get it. Call me back eventually. Katie could tell she didn't understand anything either. She thought about what Tony's first wife had said all day. And when her husband got home, she told him. Naomi called. How? Tony's reaction seemed too emotional to Kathy. Listening to the tape, she nodded at the phone and left the room. When Kathy returned, Tony was sitting up, holding his head. Why did she do that? Her husband repeated the phrase several times. My God, why did she do that? Do you still love her? There was no answer to that question for Kathy, but she didn't give up. At any rate, you love your son. I happened to hear the tape, and I can tell you I don't understand it either. Write a will if they want one. Leave everything you have to your child. You realize I didn't marry you for money back in the day. But Tony, without answering her, slammed the door, ran down the stairs, and did not return until late at night. Lying awake, waiting for her husband's return, Kathy was determined it was time. By this time, she had her eye on a house. In a neighboring region, in a remote village. Kathy looked at the satellite map. Forests, rivers, lakes. The village wasn't completely cut off from civilization. There was a bus. There were stores, a church, a house of culture. But all that was secondary. Katie was mesmerized by the pictures of the huge sky. You can't see such a sky in the city. It is covered by multi-story buildings, trees, power lines. And there's a sky from horizon to horizon, and clouds of fantastic beauty. A river with yellow lilies, sandy shoulders, houses above the lake, on which white geese swim. The house Katie chose for herself was yellow, with a green roof. 5 rooms, amenities she could hardly do without, and the price was ridiculous for the city. Here you could only buy a room in a communal apartment for that kind of money. Katie called a realtor, and to the immense surprise of the real estate specialist, formalized the deal in absentia, without even coming to see the house, without trying to bring down the price. It suits me, she said briefly, and transferred the money. Now she knew that the house was waiting for her, and the keys were kept at Aunt Catherine, a neighbor. The young woman was just waiting for an opportunity to escape. And then Tony told her that he was going away for a few days on a business trip. He had a guilty look on his face, realizing that, left alone, Kathy would be completely bored. Would you consider a companion? He asked. We'll decide when you get back, Katie said discreetly. And when I get back, we'll go out. Tony was not completely free of guilt, maybe to a restaurant. And have you started planning our next vacation? Maybe you want to go to some tropical island. I don't want to go to the islands, Katie replied seriously. There are plenty of islands in my life, like our house. What if we went to Paris or Rome? Now Tony's hesitating. We'll talk about it later, he said softly and hurried off to the car. Katie knew she had a week at her disposal now, but the trouble was she had no plan to get out of the house. Video surveillance in every room, except for the restrooms, and of course the guard wouldn't let her out of the gate without the owner's permission. Katie had never played chess, wasn't into detectives, and was incapable of thinking up clever combinations. In the end, she chose a very simple option, which did not guarantee success. There was a servant cook and several maids in the house. One of the girls, Lita, was about the same height and build as Kathy. And in the evening, at the hour when the servants were leaving, which was supposed to be done through the back door, Kathy changed into her uniform, a black dress with a collar, in the dressing room. She covered her head with a headscarf and sneaked out through the back garden gate. It opened with a digital code, but Katie knew the combination of numbers. Tentatively in her room, she arranged things so that you'd think there was a sleeping person lying in bed. It was just that he pulled a blanket over his head. Katie also told the girls that she had a headache, would take a sleeping pill, and asked them not to bring her coffee in the morning, not to wake her up. Will get up on her own when she gets a good night's sleep. But under her pillow, the young woman slipped a note. Katie wrote that she was forced to take this step because she can no longer live by the rules she does not understand, and she couldn't bear to be completely isolated. She said that she would make herself known soon, thanking Tony for his wonderful treatment of her, for spoiling her for so many years. You probably have good reasons for leading just such an existence, she wrote, but I just can't afford it. Please believe me, I'm not leaving for another man. I just want to live a normal life. Don't try to get me back. Captivity and love are incompatible. Katie didn't take any belongings with her, only her papers and money. When, to her immense surprise, she managed to get out of the house unharmed, she hailed a cab and asked for a ride to the bus station. It would have been possible to get there at once, but the young woman was afraid that Tony would follow her trail. He would find the cab driver, put pressure on him to give her exact address. It would be better to confuse the tracks a little. She had 3 transfers to make. She did not reach the village she had chosen to live in until late afternoon the next day. There was something sad about getting off a bus in the dark, in a village where no one was waiting for you. Katie had studied the map beforehand and knew she had to go right to the church and then turn around. There was no need to ask for directions. The young woman was surprised by the darkness of the streets. There were very few streetlights, and they only illuminated a limited section of the road. There were potholes in the asphalt, so be careful not to twist your leg. The few passers-by who were seen on the road wore hats or headbands with headlamps and reminded Katie of miners. Katie felt an immense sense of relief when she saw her house. She knocked on her neighbor's door, and she was greeted with a very welcoming welcome. "I'll get the key out. Why don't you have a car? Where are your things?" Katie explained that she had come by bus, and her things would arrive later. After these words, Aunt Catherine forced the young woman to take a bag of potatoes, shoved in it, and a couple of jars with preparations. "How could you dare to go out at such a distance at night with only one purse? Your house is a mess right now. What are you gonna eat for dinner? All the stores are closed. In the morning, go to the grocery store 2 steps from here. What rustic bread they sell here. And what buns. You'll like them. If you want, come to my place for breakfast, and I'll give you a flashlight. I have a spare. You won't be able to unlock the gate without it. You'll have to find the keyhole." Katie had a strange feeling when she locked the gate behind her. Yes, there was a high-strung fence, but it did not look like a fortress wall, and she did not feel like a prisoner. On the contrary, there was a blissful sense of calmness that she was at home. Fortunately, the owners had left some furniture. In one room there was a narrow bed, in the other an old sofa and an upholstered armchair. Katie was tired, both from the long journey and from the excitement. But she was terribly hungry, and she mentally thanked Aunt Katia. Boiled potatoes in a jacket pot, opened a jar of pickles. This simple food, compared to those delicacies that Katie had eaten in recent years, seemed to the young woman inexpressibly delicious. And Katie fell asleep as she had in her childhood, soundly, dreamlessly, as if she had fallen into an abyss. She slept for a long time, almost until noon, as if only now she realized how exhausted her previous life had been. Katie realized that her disappearance had long since been discovered, that they were probably looking for her. Of course, and Tony had already been tipped off. The day before, when she had to wait for a transfer at the regional center, she had bought herself a new SIM card for her phone, without registering a name. She herself remembered all the numbers she needed by heart. The day would come, she'd call Tony, ask him to finalize the divorce. He must understand her. Kathy was busy lovingly fixing up her new home. It had been a long time since she had to do this kind of work. Strangely, she hadn't liked it before, but now she almost enjoyed dusting, moving furniture, scrubbing floors, and then there was a knock on the gate. Kathy shuddered, hesitating whether to open or not. But then she recognized Aunt Catherine's voice. "Katie, are you alive in there?" It turned out that a neighbor had brought her milk. "Still warm," she said, handing her the can. "Do you have a refrigerator? Did you go to the store?" Apparently, Aunt Catherine immediately thought that Katie was a city dweller, a completely helpless underachiever, and had to be taught to be smart like a little girl. "There, the red roof, see?" The neighbor pointed her finger. "Go shopping there. You won't find bread. They've been selling it since morning. But we have everything else. Well, you're good at sleeping. We'd all get up at the crack of dawn here, who has a cow, who has a vegetable garden. We'd only have to work when it's cold, before it's hot." In the following days, Katie felt that she was being watched and wondered why. She dressed very simply, jeans, a tank top of some kind. But strangers would say hello to her on the street, give her looks. Later she realized that new people are rare here and always arouse interest. The village was large, stretching for several kilometers, and there was no family here without a bicycle. Even the old ladies got on the saddle, kicked off their legs, and went about their business. Kathy remembered her younger years when she loved to walk, so she spent all her free time walking, exploring her surroundings, A few kilometers from the village, she found a beautiful big river, fast but shallow. And for a long time she stood on the bridge, admiring the play of the sun, the rippling of algae, small skittish fish. Then the young woman crossed the bridge and followed the path winding through the forest wherever she could see. Her mind was on her own, her stride was sprawling, and Katie also forgot the time. Then she noticed another trail that went off to the right, and she turned onto it. A few minutes later, Katie came to the lake. Two fishermen stared at her like she was a wonder to behold. "Where did you come from?" One of them asked. "Did you go for mushrooms?" Katie shrugged. "No, I'm just walking." "Are you from?" The man clarified, naming her village. Katie nodded. "You walk a long way," the fisherman said almost admiringly, "without a car, without a bicycle. And there are wild boars here, by the way. And there are wolves and vipers. I'll be aware of that. Don't worry, I won't bother you. I'll take a picture of the lake and leave." Katie took out of the breast pocket of her shirt a telephone of the shore, covered with dense forest, thickets of reeds, amber water. The lake was really very picturesque. The rumor of the fearless or reckless maiden had spread through the village. Now, as Katie walked, she heard people say, "She's the one who goes alone to Lake Bright." A few weeks would pass, and Katie would appreciate the hot bread, even sweet as it seemed only in her childhood, and the goat's milk, and the strawberries that Aunt Catherine gave her, saying, "You eat. You look so pale, you must have been starving in the city, poor thing. And the air here is so fresh that it makes you dizzy. And the nights, when the sky without city lights seems to glow by itself, so many stars in it." Once Katie, taking an evening walk, took a road she never traveled before. She thought that the village would end here, near this wood, but as she passed it, she saw that she was mistaken. On her left hand stood the remains of a mansion. Apparently, someone started to build here in the 90s, but did not finish the job. On the right hand were the houses opposite, quite old. One-storied, divided into 3 or 4 apartments, which could be understood by the number of stovepipes. And even farther away from the others, in the distance, stood a house that said, "I am on my own." The house was densely planted with birch trees, and further on there was a field. A ginger cat sat on the road. It must have lived in the house, or else what would a cat do in the fields? A white goat walked freely at the gate. Katie heard the noise of a car pulling up and stepped aside, giving way. The Jeep drove past. The window was open. And Kathy saw a dark-haired man of about 35. But as she only glanced at him, he looked at her intently and slowed down. "Do you know where you're going?" he asked. "Why?" There was a challenge in Katie's voice. "It's 20 kilometers down a dirt road to the nearest village. Are you sure you want to go there?" "I wonder why everyone around here knows exactly where and how I'm supposed to go." Katie felt like she was being rude, but she couldn't help it. "Why do you care?" She expected that after these words the man would either answer her with some offensive phrase or move on. But his voice was calm. "I'm a local forester, and if you knew how many times I've had to look for people who got lost when they went mushrooming or decided to find a water body lost in the forest on their own. But I'm kind of on the road, walking. I can turn around anytime I want and go back to where I came from." "Who did you come to see?" He probably didn't think that a young woman could move to the country on her own initiative, as they say, to live in the country. Katie couldn't stand it and laughed. "No, you are amazingly curious," she said. "What if I'm a local now?" "Really? People are just leaving here lately. No jobs, no entertainment, no services. By the way, my name's Archie and I live in this house, yeah, this one right here." "Is the cat yours?" "It's mine. Mousetrapper by birth. And to tell you the truth, I wasn't planning on getting a goat. Some acquaintances gave it to me for borscht, but I couldn't slaughter it." "Are you so gentle and delicate?" Again, he didn't react to the irony. "No. It's just that I've been in hot spots, and after that I can't. Raise your hand on a living thing. See the blood." Archie caught on. "I'm the reason you're standing in the heat. Why don't you come to my house? I have cold kvass, milk. See how I live." Theoretically, Kathy shouldn't have liked the offer. If Archie was married, it's unlikely he'd invite her. And if he was single and there were not enough young women in the village. But to her own surprise, Kathy agreed to come in. Archie's house was a simple wooden house, probably built in the middle of the last century. It was clean inside, but it wasn't cozy. but the owner must have stocked it with everything he needed. High rubber boots, a rifle on the wall, several kinds of lanterns, sacks with sugar, flour, cereals. Isn't it scary living like this, out in the middle of nowhere, away from everyone? Katie asked. Now it was his turn to be surprised. What would I be afraid of? Even if there were bears? No, I don't mean predators. I mean, how do you get out of here in the winter? Or call an ambulance? The ambulance won't get through, that's for sure. But I have a snowmobile and a horse. Katie's eyes lit up. Really? Show me. He took her to the stable, and Katie marveled at the sight of the mighty Raven stallion. It was a gift from friends. They bought Diamond when I was recovering from my injury. The horse was not allowed to stagnate, so I had to ride him through pain, through strength. So you're a professional? Kathy didn't realize 2 hours had passed. Archie was surprisingly interesting to talk to. Then another younger guy came into the room. My brother Billy introduced him to Archie. Katie thought Billy looked at her strangely. He couldn't take his eyes off Kathy for a long time, until finally she asked him, "Do I remind you of someone?" He flinched, and then shook his head negatively. They talked about everything. Billy was silent though. And when the young woman got ready to go home, her new acquaintance drove her to the gate. That evening the young woman was in high spirits. She wanted to hum and waltz, as if she were a little girl. It was only now that Kathy remembered that she hadn't brought the one thing she wanted, a camera. After all, Tony wouldn't need one. Had she really, after all these years of not picking up her Canon, felt like taking pictures again? Was she really coming to life with her soul here? The phone rang. It was so sudden that Katie flinched. It was followed by the thought of who might be calling her. She hadn't given her number to anyone, had she? She shouldn't have answered. Maybe it was a bank that wanted to offer her a loan. At home, she was sick of such calls. Katie couldn't explain why she'd answered. "Hello," she heard her husband's voice. She froze. How could he have figured her out? But it was as if Tony was reading her mind, answering her unasked questions. "How I found you is not important. Listen to me. Are you okay? More or less. But how? And what do you want? Remember what I'm about to tell you. Don't tell me where you are. And don't go home under any circumstances. Not until I call you again. I wasn't gonna, I'm sorry. What's wrong? Can you at least give me a hint?" That's a stupid request. When talking to Kathy, Tony never talked about his work or his problems. The less you know, the better you sleep. You wait. I'll call you and then we'll definitely meet, but not before. Don't worry, I won't try to get you back. I mean, you did the right thing to run away now. It's like the finger of fate or something. How's your family? How's Naomi? Katie didn't know what else to ask. Naomi? Katie felt the question hit her husband where it hurt. "I'm sorry, I can't say any more. Stay where you are and don't let anyone know about you. And I'll still love you, Katie. Always. What the hell is going on?" Katie screamed, unable to stand it. But Tony had already cut the conversation short and disconnected the phone. Katie was back to the very fear she had hoped to get rid of here, in these quiet places where nature itself evoked a sense of peace. She wondered why Tony hadn't asked her where she was. Maybe he already knew it, since he'd managed to figure out her phone number, or maybe he didn't want to memorize the name of the place so he wouldn't give it away in any way, even by accident. Anxiety was building, and Katie began to tell herself that there was nothing she could do, nothing depended on her. And since Tony had told her to stay here, it was the safest place for her to be. One day followed another. They were so peaceful, so unhurried, that the young woman began to calm down. There was almost no room left for night. Katie woke up very early, but it was already light outside. Slapping her bare feet on the floor with pleasure, she walked to the kitchen. The house was clean and cozy, and this house belonged to her. Katie took her time making tea, opened the window, and sat by it for a long time, enjoying the smells of flowers and herbs. Now she would go to the local store on time and pick up a whole bag of still warm bread and rolls. They were wonderfully fragrant and really brought back memories of childhood. The young woman continued to garden with pleasure, and during the day Archie would call her and suggest that they go out together. In the city they would go to the theater, to the movies, or to the park. But here he would drive up to her house in his old Jeep, Kathy would get into his car, and they would drive around the far reaches of the forest, visit lakes lost in the wilderness. Archie would talk about the animals that lived there, about the plants, some of which were listed in the Red Book, and recalled the legends and legends associated with the area. And they would have a picnic somewhere near the spring. Everything tasted amazingly good, and they washed their sandwiches down with spring water. Katie felt herself getting stronger, her head was clearer, and her anxiety was beginning to recede. She was very tanned and looked like a girl who could never have been her age. One thing she regretted was that she hadn't brought her camera. "I'm as good without it as without hands," she said to Archie. "Professional equipment is very expensive, and I can't afford a new one now. In short, I need my camera right now. I can make money with it. People have bought pictures from me before. In addition, you can participate in competitions. That's money too. I think I'll probably go and see him after all." Since she hadn't told Archie the details of her old life, he saw no reason to discourage her. "If you want to make it to my weekend, I can drive you there and back," he suggested. "We'll see," Katie replied vaguely. In the meantime, her greatest joy was that Archie was teaching her to ride. He had brought a second horse from somewhere, and now they often went horseback riding at sunset and returned when the stars were already lit up in the sky. After these rides, Katie slept like a dead woman. Once, when Archie was at work, Kathy went for a walk alone. She came back in a great mood, having seen enough of the bluey meadows, heard the birds singing, and watched the puffy clouds that floated slowly across the sky. Katie didn't hear someone approach her. A man's voice sounded behind her. She flinched violently and turned around. She didn't recognize Billy right away. Archie's brother. After that one and only meeting with him, she hadn't seen him again and was beginning to forget him. "I've been wanting to catch you for a long time," he went on. "Why?" "Archie won't tell me anything, and I've noticed that you're very different from the local women. And the country people, if they come here, they come not alone, but with a family or a company. You've bought a house, Archie tells me, haven't you?" Katie was wary. For some reason, she was frightened by this guy with the icy eyes. She weighed every word, though she didn't usually do that. "Yes," she said cautiously, "I did." "So you're going to live here all year round, or it'll be like the summer house?" "I don't know yet." "And you have no one to live here with you? No husband to visit? How do you know I'm married?" Katie couldn't take it anymore. She only put up with these questions because it was Archie's brother, and also because they were just approaching the village. There were no people around, and Katie was afraid to make Billy angry. Who knows what he'd do? "I know," Billy sighed. "A village house, even the best one, needs a man's hand. Maybe your father's coming." "I don't even know him, my father. My mom raised me. It happens, you know. The only thing I know about my father is his name." "Was he?" "I have no idea if he's alive or dead. There's not even a picture of him in the house. We never corresponded, never called, or maybe he doesn't even know I exist. Have you had enough? And what's the reason for these questions? You've been wanting to catch me for a long time. For what? What do you want from me?" "Nothing anymore," Billy shrugged his shoulders and took a step to the side. "Go on your way." Katie walked on and felt him escorting her with his gaze. She really didn't have much money left after buying the house. The young woman decided to go to the place where she had lived before, to pick up her camera and some other personal belongings. For all Tony's faults, his word could be relied upon. Since he said he wouldn't keep her, she could rest assured. Katie hit the road on a weekday. It was spontaneous. She woke up and realized that after a long day of heat, the cooler weather had finally arrived. Now was the only time to go. When else? At least she wouldn't wear herself out on the road in the blazing sun. There was one thing Katie hadn't considered. She didn't know the bus schedule, and she'd reach the city in the evening. Now she had to get back to the city in the morning or get a hotel room. Katie thought she would decide what she would do later. For some reason, she decided not to enter the house through the main entrance, although the guard would surely have let her in. She went to the far wicket, the one for the servants. Subconsciously, after she'd managed to get out unhindered last time, she considered it a lucky move. This time too, she dialed the right combination of numbers and the door opened. Of course, the girls who worked in the house had long since gone home. What made Katie uneasy was the fact that there were no lights on in the windows of the mansion. That meant Tony wasn't here. Katie had the key, she knew she'd get in, and she decided that maybe it was for the best. It was a very strange feeling to enter the house she'd lived in for 10 years, a house she could walk around with her eyes closed, unmistakably finding switches in total darkness. The house Katie thought she would live in forever. Now she was a guest. The young woman silently made her way up to the second floor where her room was. Nothing had changed here. The camera in its case lay on the top shelf in the closet. Katie hung it on her shoulder. She put in her bag the medical policy, which she had forgotten about, took a few of her favorite dresses off the rack. Suddenly she heard the door downstairs open. Katie froze. Voices were heard. Tony hadn't come home alone. Another amazing moment. When she'd lived here, they never had visitors. Now there were at least 2 other men here besides her husband. Kathy didn't know what she should do. Should she wait for the guests to leave and then talk to her husband? They needed to discuss the divorce anyway. Or was it better to slip out now, unnoticed? Katie picked up her bag, which was quite light, and sneaked around the house. She could walk completely unheard. Her path took her past her husband's study, and the door to it was slightly ajar. Katie wanted to skip past the danger, but what she heard made her stop short. "And you think we can't find anything on our own?" A man's voice asked mockingly. There was a pause. "Why not?" "Try," Tony replied, as if through effort. "Do a good deed," he said himself. "You won't need those stones anymore anyway. There are no pockets in the coffin, as they say." "I don't know why you are so sure that I still have the stones. Maybe their existence is a legend. But even if you do, why did you go to Naomi first? She couldn't possibly know anything." "Because you started your collection while you were still together, and she may well have unknowingly told us where to look. Well, you have nothing to be sorry about. Just an ex-wife." Katie put her hand to her mouth and bit her fingers to keep from screaming. "Well," began the second voice, which seemed even affectionate, "we know your character well, and that you can't be forced to confess either. But you're still coming with us. There's someone you need to talk to." "I see." Kathy thought Tony sounded calm. "How are you going to make my disappearance look good? Who's gonna be looking for you? You've always been a recluse. You'll be working under close supervision. The drugs you've created have made a lot of money. If you don't want to repay your debt with jewelry, you'll work for us for free. We know you have some very interesting ideas." Katie managed to take a few pictures through the ajar door. Then she heard footsteps moving away. Her hands were shaking as she put the camera in its case. Suddenly, on the back, she saw numbers written directly on the skin with a chemical pencil. They hadn't been here before. What if? Her mind told her to get out of the house as fast as she could. But something inside her wouldn't let Katie do it. For Tony's sake, she had to. She didn't need anything, but he had a son. So she slipped out of the house as silently as a shadow, closed the door behind her, and went where she had never dared to go before, to the enclosure with Arston. The tiger was asleep, but of course he heard her approach and raised his mighty head. Katie feared that in the time she had been away, the animal had forgotten her. They had been acquainted before, but Arston's memory was good. He came to the grate and looked at Katie expectantly. He seemed to be waiting for her to pet him. The young woman inwardly froze with fear and touched the warm fur with her fingers. She had to do it, because now she was going to go in there, to the beast. Would he let her do it? Could animals sense human fear? Katie pulled back the latch and entered the enclosure. For a few moments she stood motionless, even closed her eyes. Nothing depended on her now. If Arston wanted to, he could take her down in a heartbeat, with a swipe of his paw. But the tiger came close, inhaled what sounded like a deep sigh, stepped back, and lay down again. Turned his head away, lowered his muzzle to his paws. It seemed to Katie that his whole posture expressed sadness. Maybe he had somehow learned that his master was in trouble. But every extra moment spent here was fraught with great danger. Katie walked over to the drain, squatting down. She doubted that she would be able to handle the grate. However, much to her surprise, she lifted it without difficulty. Then she turned on the flashlight on her cell phone and shone it down. There, on the right, an iron door, and there were numbers on it. Katie opened the case again and began dialing the combination, checking back now and then against Tony's entry. It was just a guess. Maybe the combination meant something else entirely, like someone's phone number. But the door opened with an audible creak. Excitedly, oblivious to Arston's presence, Katie reached inside and pulled out a small leather pouch. She untied the drawstring. The cell phone trembled in her hand, but the young woman, even in the wrong light, realized yes, this was the one. Several large gemstones, it seemed to be an emerald, and this a diamond. Katie wasn't sure. She'd never become a pro at jewelry. But there, a smooth, heavy ball of black crystal lay in the palm of her hand. It was the size of a large apple. It was the only thing Katie had stuffed into her bag. She hurriedly put the rest back into the bag, tightened the drawstring, returned the treasure to its place, and slammed the safe door shut. Now put the bars back in place, straighten her stiff legs, and run. Run out of here, making sure no one saw her, no one knew she was here, and witnessed what was happening. She herself couldn't explain why she hadn't brought the stones with her. In the first place, Katie was firmly convinced that they were not hers, but Tony's sons. Secondly, these scary people wouldn't give up. They try to unravel the whole chain. Maybe they don't know about the orb. What's it worth to them? But if they do find the safe, and they decide that all the treasure is in place, they won't look any further, and they won't come out on her, Katie. And finally, it just seemed to her that these jewels were bringing bad luck. Katie was in no condition to sit patiently at the station, waiting for her bus. She made her way home by cab, changing cars several times to avoid giving possible pursuers a lead. She arrived in her village at the very hour when dawn was just breaking. And the scene was so peaceful that the young woman even shook her head as if she had dreamed all the events that had taken place. It was quiet, with only the occasional mooing of cows and the occasional barking of dogs. Katie asked the cab driver to stop the car near the church. "I'll take you from here," she said. She wanted more than anything to run to Archie right now and tell him everything, but she couldn't afford to do that either. She had to think it over first. She paced the house, drinking tap water, cup after cup, talking to herself, even gesticulating. In short, from the outside she could well be mistaken for insane. It was Sunday. Katie decided to wait until at least 10 o'clock in the morning before going to Archie's. The crystal ball drew her in. She wanted to see why it had become so precious, to stroke the silky dark surface, to look into the depths of it as if she were diving into an abyss, but something was stopping her. Perhaps it was the fortune teller's words. Adlaya did not tell her to look into the black depths of the ball. Her voice sounded as if she were right next to her. "Otherwise you'll be cursed like me." Katie heard a car stop outside the house and was scared to death. Could someone already know where she was hiding? God, but he'd have to be racing like a madman to be here in such a short time. The young woman lifted herself up on tiptoe and peered over the fence, almost crying with relief. It was Archie pulling up. That's his car, and there he is, knocking on the gate. I'm coming, Katie shrieked. It seemed to her that Archie couldn't have just arrived. Maybe the news had already told of Tony's death. After all, he was a famous man. They pounced on each other with questions at the same time. How did you know? Where were you? Disappeared without saying anything. Katie stared at Archie for a few seconds and realized that he knew nothing. I need to talk to you, she said. I wanted to invite you to the remote lake today, Archie confessed, but I was afraid you weren't back yet. Just in case, I brought a picnic. All right, let's go. Hold on, just a minute. Katie rushed into the house, slipped the crystal ball back into her bag, threw on a light jacket and hurried to Archie's house. This trip was the longest they had ever made. The Jeep was so off-road, so thicketed, that Kathy thought she'd never get out of here alone, she'd get lost. But the lake itself was beautiful, and it was very rare for a human being to set foot here. Maybe no one had come here for several years. Therefore, nature was in its pristine beauty, and the singing of birds made me dizzy. Maybe if the scenery hadn't been so peaceful, Kathy wouldn't have had the heart to remember all she'd been through. She was afraid Archie wouldn't believe her, but he asked a few clarifying questions and then fell silent, deep in thought. She sensed, however, that he didn't think her story was bullshit and was thinking about what to do next. I have the pictures, she said quietly. You don't think I dreamed this whole thing? Archie just took a deep breath. God forbid anyone should ever guess that you were there, saw and heard it all. God help it. Get in the car. Quick, ordered Archie. Kathy couldn't remember later how she had ended up next to him. At the same time, she had no doubt that the black ghost-like car had not been there by chance. No sooner had they moved off than it began to pursue them. Hold on tight. The mad race seemed endless to Katie. Off-road, over bumps. She had no idea Archie could drive like that. He'd send the Jeep going one way, then the other, suddenly swerving. If they start shooting, blow out the tires then, he threw, and Katie knew what he meant. Then they'll be completely at the mercy of the pursuers. They're unarmed. Now here's what we'll do. Katie closed her eyes as the Jeep raced across the field, shaking so hard she bit her tongue. She couldn't get away from the black car, but it didn't seem to bother Archie. Suddenly, the Jeep swerved so sharply that the straps sank into her body. Katie opened her eyes. They were standing on the edge of a cliff, the front and back wheels of the Jeep almost overhanging it. And the black car was flying downward. It would have taken Archie to know the terrain as well as he knew it to make such a risky move. He swerved in time, and the pursuers were gone. A few more moments in the car, lying at the bottom of a deep ravine, exploded, bursting into flames. Katie lost her ability to hear and think for a few moments. She came to her senses when Archie held her close to him and stroked her head like a little girl. "That's it. That's it. No one's going to hurt you now. Everything's going to be okay now." Kathy cried and couldn't stop, and soon the shirt on Archie's chest was completely wet. A few weeks after these events, Kathy and Archie were walking along the paths of a park in the very town where the young woman had once lived. Now she had come here because urgent business awaited her presence, and today Archie had joined her. It was drizzling a nasty little rain, a cold rain that suggested not the end of summer, but rather deep fall. But Kathy had a big umbrella, and she and Archie had forgotten about the rain. He was later found in his own home. It's thought he died of a stroke. The funeral was heartfelt, Kathy said, not for pro forma reasons. Tony was a good man, no matter what, so you could see that people really felt sorry for him. A lot of people were crying. His son Nani, he's not a little boy, he's a teenager. He tried to hold on. Poverty is not threatening him, of course. The stones have been turned into money, and Nani will be a very wealthy man. I've given up my share of the inheritance. Turns out Tony had it all worked out. Nani would soon go to England, attend a boarding school until he came of age, and then he has enough money to pay for his own education in any university. He'll own his father's house too. And that beautiful tiger? Arston will go to a reserve in the Far East. It's a long way, of course, but he'll be in a natural environment. No zoos. If he hadn't led me into the enclosure then, God knows what would have happened. We should all be grateful to him. Kathy pulled her hand lightly from Archie's palm. Well, we're almost there. They stood outside Adlaya's house. No one opened the door for a long time. Then light footsteps were heard, and the door opened, chain first. Adlaya was wearing a black silk robe with embroidered dragons. Without her headdress, with her hair falling to her shoulders, she seemed younger to Katie than the last time she had been here. "Hello, Katie began. Adlaya threw back the chain. "Come in, and you don't have to tell me anything. I know everything." The fortune teller led them into the same office where Kathy had been last time. The young woman silently took a black crystal ball out of her bag and held it out to Adlaya. She only nodded, not saying thank you. It was as if a thing that should have belonged to her and no one else had been returned to her. "What do you want to ask me?" She turned to Katie. "Don't worry, I won't take a dime. Ask the question that concerns you most. Where do I live?" Katie asked and hesitated a moment. "Where is the place on earth where nothing can threaten me and I can just face each morning and enjoy it?" Adlaya placed the orb on the table in a bronze stand that looked as if it had been specially designed for it and said, "See for yourself." "But you said I'd be cursed then." "I'm already cursed. Look." Katie looked into the dark depths and suddenly she saw her house, the same green roof farmhouse she had grown to love. And there were people there too. Katie realized she saw herself opening the gate, and Archie was holding her hand. They entered the yard together. Kathy looked around to see if Archie had seen what she had seen. He squeezed her hand tightly, and she realized what that meant. Together forever. At one time, when Billy and Archie had been boys, they had often quarreled and even fought. At first, Mom had tried to appeal to their consciences. Who's smarter, the first to give in? Stop. Shut up. But then she was convinced it didn't work. One day Archie, from Billy's point of view, did something really mean. He'd agreed to play hide and seek with the younger kids in the yard. It fell to Billy to drive. He looked for his brother and his buddies for a long time, but found no one. Then it turned out that Archie called the whole group home, and they watched Billy looking for them from the windows of the apartment and laughed about it. "I'll never forgive you for the rest of my life." Billy shrieked with angry tears when he found out. Mom urged Archie to apologize, to ask his brother for forgiveness. But Archie was self-loving and decided not to humiliate himself in front of his youngest. Instead, they stopped talking. 2 weeks passed. Of course, it was hard on Mom, too. There were two warring camps in the house, and she was between them, and it was clear she was siding with her youngest son. Billy's birthday was coming up. The day before, his mother came into his room. "Well," she asked sadly, "are we going to live like this?" "Why?" "I can see you're having a hard time of it too. You know why? Because you can't forgive your brother. And he doesn't think it's his fault. He's walking around all proud of himself. Believe me, he feels bad too. He's just playing it cool. I'm about to tell you an amazing secret. You want to know it?" Billy couldn't take it anymore. "Well, if you forgive him, truly, wholeheartedly, the higher powers will be on your side from now on. Magical things will start to happen." "You're kidding." "Try it and find out," Mom said. Billy thought about it until he fell asleep. The next day, Archie felt very awkward. He knew it was his little brother's birthday. In the evening, Mom would set the table, the guests would come. And in the morning, she had already given Billy his present. "Well, I guess I'll be out playing soccer with the boys tonight, for the rest of the day, without looking at anyone," Archie said. Then Billy got over himself and asked, "Aren't you going to get me anything? You're not going to eat the cake." He didn't need the gift at all. What was important was that he spoke first. He handed his brother an olive branch of peace. Tears welled up in Archie's eyes. It was clear how much he really cared. He rushed to his room, broke the piggy bank, dumped all the coins into the palm of his hand, and brought them to his brother. "Here, buy yourself whatever you want." Billy knew Archie was saving up for a new soccer ball, but forgiving his brother was more important to Archie. Billy had never had such a happy birthday. And since then, he couldn't remember a time when he and Archie had had a big fight. His brother tried not to hurt him anymore. And now that Billy, didn't even have to do anything, it was enough just to turn Katie over to the men who had come to get her. And he hadn't done that, and save her from that moment, Billy felt an unprecedented relief. It was as if the pain he had long carried inside him had finally let go. Katie never found out about it all. And soon Betty Walker, who was in charge of catching dogs, was literally caught by the hand. Turns out the lady was laundering a lot of money, and illegal fines, and pseudo reports, and the funds allocated for the construction of the shelter, and floated away unknown, where all this was a matter of her shiny hands with manicured fingernails. Now she had to answer, and her influential husband could not help her now. The case was taken up by the people's elected representative, who was very fond of such revelations. The people were delighted by them. It turns out that Walker herself could be punished. Betty got a real sentence. Nothing helped her. Harry lost his place because of the publicity the story received. Even in his own community, they tried not to give him a hand. The man began to drink. With grief, he remembered his first wife, but she had long since been remarried and did not want to know him. So he sought out Katie's mother. Harry felt guilty for the woman. He had left her pregnant at one time and had done nothing to help her. And when she had called him one single time and asked him to borrow money, Katie was very ill and needed expensive medication. He had only given up. "You were stupid to keep the baby. I told you I wouldn't help you, and you couldn't take care of him on your own. See, it turned out just like I said it would, and he hung up on me. Now he's come to confess. Figured God must be punishing him for his sins. What can I do for you?" He asked Katie's mom, or for her daughter. The woman just waved her hand. Then she said, "Help the boy who saved Katie. He's got to get his criminal record expunged." So Harry had to help Billy, who he wanted to kill. The story with the escape managed to be hushed up. New circumstances surfaced in the murder case. The best lawyer defended the guy now, and Billy was released. Amazing things are going to start happening. He heard his mom's voice say, "You just have to forgive me. Let go of the hurt." "What do you want to do now?" his brother asked. Billy shrugged. "I'm going to the seaside for a week. I need to think, come to my senses. I want to be alone." "I understand," Archie nodded. "But don't hurt me. Take some money from me and Katie. Let it count as a present for all the birthdays we've been apart." Billy sat on the beach, on the warm rocks. It was getting evening, and the vacationers were going home. But a girl of about 5 didn't want to leave. She had long blonde hair, a red poppy sundress, and scraped knees. She was always playing with the sea. She fearlessly ran into it. She shrieked when a higher wave approached her. She stroked the sea with her palms. "Inga, that's enough," her mother reprimanded her. But she only shook her head. "Let's go home." No, Mom, more. It's so nice here. Billy looked at the girl whose life was just beginning and thought that it wasn't too late for him to start over.
Thank you for watching this video to the end. Subscribe to the channel. Like it, write comments if you like the story, and see you on the channel.